All right, so I want to give you these notes. Those of you that missed them in class, may not be exactly what we did in class because it's hard to replicate that, but just print these out and then annotate them. Put some of the things I'm putting on. If there's something I don't put on and you want to do that as well. Okay, so we talked about photosynthesis a little bit last week. Photosynthesis is where sunlight goes to a plant. The plant then uses some other products and it produces glucose. That's just a simple definition of it. And then this glucose is then used by all organisms, whether they're plants or animals, whatever they are, to then produce their own energy by using something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It has two stages. We're going to look at these in a minute, but one is called the light dependent, which means that it needs light. Then the other one is light independent or dark reactions. We'll go into more detail in a minute in those. So two main stages. And in plants, you'll find this process occurring mostly in leaves. Not the stem very often, can occur in the root because they're under the ground for most plants. And the organelle that completes this process or helps complete this process is the chloroplast. The chloroplast is like a circular organelle. It's membrane bound, so it has an outer membrane. And just like cells have that phospholipid bilayer, so does this chloroplast as well. Inside the chloroplast are then these little thylakoids membranes, lots of these little stacks. And this is really where one of the stages of photosynthesis occurs, and the other one is in this open space in here as well. And it relies upon things wanting to go from high to low. But that's it, chloroplast. And this is plants and other autotrophs. But really, we're talking about plants for the most part. And, when I say plants, I'm including algae, the, photosynthetic plants found in the water. They're a little bit different than the land plants we think of. So the first one are the light-dependent reactions, and this requires sunlight. So if the sun's not out, it cannot do this. When we think of photosynthesis, it's CO2 plus H2O. So these are the reactants. The plant or the organelle uses carbon dioxide, it uses water. The energy it relies upon is sunlight. And then it produces C6H12O6, which is glucose, and it produces oxygen as well. So that's kind of the equation for this, but it requires sunlight. So even if you have carbon dioxide and you have H2O and you don't have any sunlight, there's really not any way for this process to continue. So keep that in mind. When we look at these next ones, light independent or dark reactions, no light is needed. So whether there's sun out or not, it can still do this step. Okay, but you'll see here that some of the things created in this are needed in this. So if this isn't working, it's going to be hard to continue to do this long term. Okay, so this uses water and it relies upon a pigment called chlorophyll A and B. Okay, and then the sunlight excites this chlorophyll and it takes electrons off of H2O and moves it along this little pathway called the electron transport chain. And as it does that, it interacts with other compounds to make the products that are needed. Now it's pretty complex and you should watch the video. It kind of really explains it well, but you just need to know the basics, like what this equation is saying and where these processes occur. You don't need to know every single particular unless you're really into it. Then I encourage you to do that. Okay, but also during these light-dependent reactions, where this electron transport chain uses electrons to create products needed, it produces ATP and it produces oxygen. The oxygen comes from H2O. You have this oxygen on the end, so if you take an H2O and an H2O, take these two oxygens, you put them together, you get O2 gas. Okay, so that's where, during this process, it's taking these oxygen off the water, using these electrons that are getting moved along, and they get moved along in a membrane. I'll show you that in a minute. But at the same time, as it pulls these hydrogens off, these hydrogens have these electrons in the outside of their the outer electron orbital. It then uses those electrons from the hydrogens to move along and create other things like ATP. Okay, there's also something called NADPH. You don't necessarily have to know that, but that's also created and then used in another, the next stage over that's coming up. Okay, this occurs in the grana membrane, or these things, these little stacks are also called thylakoid membrane. So if I made a different picture up here, so if I go inside of here, this is a chloroplast here, and I took one of these are called thylakoids actually, but that's not that important. Okay, then if I took one of these, just like this is made up of these little phospholipid bilayers, okay, so is this. So this also, if I took a little picture of this out, it also has these phospholipid bilayers, and then this electron transport chain is embedded in the membrane of these little pancake things here. And then it accumulates hydrogen on one side, produces oxygen, and then takes all those things it produces, throws them back into this open space called the stroma. Okay, so ATP is taken, put out here. Also NADPH, it's not as important. And then the oxygen is going to go out here as well. Okay, so this occurs inside of here, so there's a difference, outside the membrane compared to inside the membrane. So that then uses that difference in concentration for hydrogen and uses that to produce ATP, this stuff here. Okay, so that's light dependent. It takes uses chlorophyll, uses water, and uses sunlight to produce oxygen and produce ATP and NADPH. The next ones that happen are the light independent reactions. Now, there are products in this from the first one, the light dependent, that are needed in here, but these can be produced and just be waiting to be used. So this can do it without light, but it can also do it if there's sunlight at the same time. So it doesn't require light, but it can occur or be being completed when there's sunlight, but it doesn't need it. But in the end, if these products made in the light dependent aren't given to this one and produced and put into the stroma, then it can't do it anyway. Okay. Another name for this is the Calvin cycle. It was a scientist that discovered it. It does not require sunlight, but can occur when there's sunlight. It needs ATP, it needs NADPH, and then it needs CO2. So plants take in CO2. They have a little thing on them called a stomata. This isn't stoma, I think it's stoma. And on the outside of a leaf, it kind of looks like two little peanuts or something. Okay, these are all over the leaf, and this is just exaggerated. It's not this big, but they get filled with water, and then they close. And then when they lose water, they open. So then things can come in like water and CO2. So plants are like taking in CO2 because they need it for this process. And then these are made, ATP and NADPH are made in the light dependent reactions. Okay, so then this also makes glucose as well. And this occurs in the stroma, which is this open space where there aren't any grana there. Okay, so then if we look at this one more time, if we look at CO2, look at this equation, glucose and oxygen, right? So this right here, this is used in the Calvin cycle. This is used in the light dependent. This is created in the Calvin cycle, and this is created in the light-dependent reactions. So this whole thing is dependent upon the two reactions, and another interesting thing about this, you think about this, so plants need CO2, right? But we need oxygen, and we produce CO2, and it's kind of like this continuous cycle where we just help each other out. And then they produce glucose that we need as well. So all kind of works out in the end. But that's kind of the process. It's two stages. The light dependent, which produces products that are then used in the light independent. And then this needs ATP, but what it does, it produces, when it's done, it produces ADP. It also produces NADP plus. These things then go back to here, into here, the other stage before, and get used again. Okay? So that's kind of the deal. And also, we didn't say here, ATP is produced in the light dependent as well. Okay? So that's kind of the notes. Make sure you watch the videos as well, and I'm going to put a little description of the graphic organizer you're going to make. All right, thanks. See you soon.